Welcome to Hearts on the Frontier, where wild lands meet untamed hearts. On Hearts on the Frontier, we bring you cinematic love stories set in the rugged heart of the American West. These are tales of sacrifice, honor, and passion, where strong men carry broken pasts, and the women who cross their paths change everything. If you love stories of frontier romance, redemption, and the quiet intensity of old souls, subscribe and join us around the fire. Today's story takes us to the brutal winter of 1887, deep in the Wyoming wilderness, where a lonely rancher named Jacob Thornton is fighting not just the most devastating blizzard the territory has ever seen, but the ghosts of his past and a future that's slipping through his frostbitten fingers. When a stranger appears at his door, barely alive and dressed in rags, Jake makes a choice that will change everything. But here's what he doesn't know: that freezing, desperate man at his doorstep isn't who he appears to be. And by tomorrow morning, Jake's entire world will be turned upside down in ways he never could have imagined. Stay with us, because what starts as a simple act of kindness becomes a story of redemption, honor, and the kind of choices that define a man's soul. The wind screamed like a wounded animal across the Wyoming plains, carrying snow so thick that day had become indistinguishable from night. Jacob Thornton stood at the frost-covered window of his cabin, watching white chaos erase the world he'd built with his own 2 hands. 42 winters he'd survived in this territory, but none like this. None that felt so much like an ending. His ice-blue eyes traced the barely visible outline of his barn, where his last 2 horses were huddled. The cattle were long gone, sold off piece by piece to Cornelius Hargrave's bank. Each transaction another slice carved from his dignity. Jake's calloused hand touched the cold glass, and for a moment, he saw her reflection there instead of his own. Sarah. Golden hair, green eyes bright with life. The ghost that lived in every corner of this cabin. "Should have left when you wanted to, sweetheart," he whispered to the memory, "before this place became a tomb." The fire in the stone hearth crackled, the only warmth left in a world gone cold. Jake turned from the window, his right leg carrying that familiar ache, a reminder of the day his horse had gone down in a storm, pinning him for hours while Sarah fought through snow to find him. That was 7 years ago, before the sickness came, before the empty chair on the porch became a monument to everything he'd lost. He poured himself coffee from the dented pot, the bitter liquid barely warm. His supplies were running low. 2 more weeks, maybe 3 if he stretched it. Then what? Hargrave had made his intentions clear enough. "Come spring, Thornton, that land becomes mine, unless you got a miracle hiding somewhere." Jake's jaw tightened beneath his graying beard. No miracles. Just a man, alone, waiting for winter to decide his fate. The knock came just after nightfall. At first, Jake thought it was the wind, playing tricks with loose shutters and old wood. But it came again, desperate, weak, unmistakably human. He grabbed his rifle from above the door, years of frontier instinct overriding compassion. The Wyoming wilderness didn't forgive careless trust. When he pulled open the heavy door, the wind nearly ripped it from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin, and there, collapsed half on his porch, half in a snowdrift, was a man. Not just any man. A wreck of humanity. Clothes torn to ribbons, face so pale it was nearly blue, hands bleeding and frozen. The tattered remains of what might have once been a gentleman's suit hung on a skeletal frame. Ice crusted his hair, his eyelashes. Another 10 minutes and he'd be a corpse. Jake's rifle lowered. This wasn't danger. This was death, asking for a stay of execution. "Jesus," Jake breathed, dropping to his knees. He grabbed the man under his arm, startled by how light he was, and dragged him inside. The stranger's eyes fluttered, conscious but barely. His lips moved, trying to form words, but only shivers came out. Jake kicked the door shut against the howling storm and laid the man near the fire. The stranger's eyes, dark brown, surprisingly sharp despite his condition, fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that felt almost like recognition, or judgment. "Easy now," Jake said, his voice rough from disuse. How long since he'd spoken to another living soul? Weeks? He stripped away the man's frozen, ruined clothes, revealing skin marked with cuts and bruises. Frostbite blackened his fingertips. Jake wrapped him in his own spare blankets, heavy wool that still smelled faintly of Sarah's lavender soap. Though she'd been gone 5 years, the stranger's teeth chattered violently. Jake lifted his head, bringing a tin cup of water to cracked lips. The man drank desperately, some spilling down his chin, and those dark eyes fixed on Jake again. This time, definitely gratitude. And something else. Surprise, maybe. As if kindness was the last thing he'd expected to find in this frozen hell. "Don't talk," Jake said. Save your strength. He heated soup-thin stuff, mostly broth and a few vegetables, and helped the stranger take it slowly. Each spoonful was a small victory against death. As the man's color began to return from corpse gray to something approaching human, Jake studied his hands. Not a working man's hands. Soft once, though scraped raw now. And there, barely visible beneath the Grima gold signet ring. Quality. The kind of thing a drifter would have pawned long ago. "Who are you?" Jake asked quietly. The stranger's eyes met his, but instead of answering, he simply whispered, "Thank you." His voice was educated, refined, completely at odds with his appearance. Then exhaustion claimed him and he slipped into unconscious sleep. Jake sat back on his heels, studying the man who'd appeared from nowhere. Every instinct told him this wasn't what it seemed, but then again, life rarely was. He thought of Sarah, how she'd always told him his heart was too big for the hard world they lived in. "You'd give your last dollar to a stranger," she used to say, half scolding, half admiring. One day, Jake Thornton, that generosity will either save you or destroy you. Looking at this broken man by his fire, Jake wondered which it would be. He stood with effort, his bad leg protesting, and fetched more blankets from the chest at the foot of his bed, the marriage bed he hadn't been able to sleep in since Sarah passed, preferring instead the hard chair by the fire. He covered the stranger carefully, then added more wood to the flames. The storm raged on outside, shaking the cabin's bones. But inside, for the first time in months, Jake didn't feel quite so alone, even if his only company was a half-dead stranger who'd probably be gone by morning. He settled into his chair, rifle across his lap, still cautious, still a frontiersman, and watched the man sleep. The fire cast dancing shadows across both their faces, two souls sheltering from different kinds of storms. By midnight, Jake dozed off, his last conscious thought a memory. Sarah, standing at this same hearth, telling him, "The measure of a man isn't what he has, Jake. It's what he's willing to give when he has nothing left." He woke to silence. The absence of sound was so profound it felt like pressure against his ears. The storm had passed. Pale dawn light filtered through the frosted window, painting everything in shades of blue and silver. The stranger still slept, breathing steadily now. The crisis passed. Jake rose stiffly, his body a catalogue of aches, and stepped onto his porch. The world had been remade. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, sculpted by wind into strange, beautiful shapes. The cold bit deep, had to be 20 below, but the sky was clear for the first time in days. Mountain peaks in the distance stood sharp against pale blue, and for a moment, despite everything, Jake felt something like peace. Then he saw them. Horses, a dozen at least, emerging from the tree line like dark spirits against the snow. A full entourage moving with purpose toward his cabin. At the front, a man in a fine black coat sat tall in his saddle, and beside him another carried what looked like a territorial flag. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his hip, but his gun belt was still inside. He stood there watching them come, his mind racing through possibilities. Hargrave's men? The law? Had the stranger brought trouble to his door? The riders pulled up 20 feet from his porch in a practiced formation. The man in the black coat dismounted with the ease of someone used to authority, and Jake's breath caught as he looked at the face beneath that fine hat. It was the stranger. Clean, healthy, dressed in impeccable gentleman's clothes, but unmistakably the same man who'd been dying by Jake's fire last night. "Mr. Thornton," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of command that had been absent in his whispered thanks. "I owe you an explanation, and a debt I can never fully repay." Jake's jaw worked, but no words came. The other riders dismounted, and he noticed their clothing, now official military-style uniforms. Guards, government men. The stranger, not a stranger at all, apparently climbed Jake's porch steps and extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Bradford. I'm the governor of Wyoming Territory." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The governor. He'd given shelter to the goddamn governor. Dressed in rags, alone in a storm, and Jake had... "I don't understand," Jake managed. Bradford's dark eyes held that same intensity from last night, but now Jake understood what he'd seen there. Not just gratitude. Respect. "I was traveling incognito, Mr. Thornton. I wanted to see the real condition of my territory without the parade of officials and prepared speeches. To understand what people actually face out here." His expression darkened. "My escorts panicked when the storm hit. They abandoned me, left me for dead to save themselves. They'll answer for that." Jake's mind spun. "You could have told me. Would it have mattered?" Bradford asked quietly. "Would you have treated me differently if you'd known?" The question hung between them. Jake thought of the soup, the blankets, The water given without question or expectation. He thought of Sarah's words. The measure of a man. No, he said finally. I reckon not. A smile touched Bradford's weathered face. That's why I'm here, Mr. Thornton. In 18 hours as governor, I've been lied to, flattered, manipulated, and abandoned. But last night, a man who had nothing gave me everything. You didn't see a title or an opportunity. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped. No hesitation, no questions, no price. He gestured to the riders behind him. These men would cut each other's throats for advancement. The bankers and politicians I meet would sell their own mothers for influence. But you, living alone in this frozen wilderness, you showed me something I thought had died in this territory. Genuine human decency. Jake felt heat rising to his face. He wasn't used to praise, wasn't comfortable with it. Any man would have done the same. No, Mr. Thornton. They wouldn't have. That's the tragedy I'm learning. Bradford pulled an envelope from his coat. This is the deed to your property. I understand you're facing foreclosure. Jake's chest tightened. Hargrave. How did the governor know? His jaw set. I don't want charity. This isn't charity. Bradford's voice sharpened with something like anger. I've made inquiries about Cornelius Hargrave. The man's a vulture, using the bank to prey on struggling ranchers. Your debts are legitimate, but the terms he's imposed are criminal. I'm purchasing your debt from the bank at fair market value. You'll repay me when you're able at reasonable terms. Consider it a loan between friends. Friends. The word felt strange. Jake hadn't had a friend since since before. Since Sarah. There's more, Bradford continued. The territorial government needs men of character. I want to appoint you as district land commissioner for this region. You'd oversee homestead claims, resolve property disputes, ensure fair dealing. It comes with a salary and authority to stop men like Hargrave from destroying lives. He paused. It comes with respect. Jake's throat tightened. Everything he'd lost, the dignity, the future, the sense of purpose that had died with Sarah being handed back to him by a man he'd given soup and blankets. It felt wrong. Too much. Like accepting would somehow cheapen what he'd done. Why, he asked, his voice rough. Why all this for one night? Bradford stepped closer, and Jake saw something profound in the man's eyes. Not pity, understanding. Because, Mr. Thornton, I grew up with nothing. Clawed my way up from poverty by convincing myself that power and position were what mattered, that showing weakness was death. Last night, lost in that storm, I thought I'd die unknown and unmourned. And you know what terrified me most? He paused, and Jake saw his jaw tighten with emotion. That I'd spent my entire life becoming someone important, but I'd forgotten how to be someone good. Then you opened that door. You didn't see a governor or a beggar. You saw a man who needed help, and you helped. You reminded me of who I was before ambition poisoned everything. You reminded me of my father, who died trying to help a neighbor and left us with nothing but his good name. Bradford's hand gripped Jake's shoulder. Let me pay this forward. Let me help you rebuild so you can help others. That's not charity. That's what community should be. Jake looked past the governor to the riders, the horses, the gleaming official seal on the document. Then he looked at his cabin, worn, weathered, held together by stubbornness and memory. Sarah's chair sat empty on the porch, and he could almost hear her voice. Sometimes, Jake, you have to let people help you. Pride's a cold comfort when you're alone. The commissioner position, Jake said slowly. I'd be stopping men like Hargrave, helping folks keep their land. That would be your primary duty. Jake thought of the families he'd seen broken by debt, scattered by cruel terms and crueler bankers. He thought of how helpless he'd felt, watching it happen, unable to do anything but survive his own slow drowning. Then I accept, he said. Not for me. For them. Bradford's smile was genuine, transforming his official face into something warmer. I hoped you'd say that. He turned to his men. Gentlemen, you're looking at Wyoming's newest land commissioner. Show him the respect the position demands. The riders dipped their heads, and Jake felt something unfamiliar. The weight of expectation, of responsibility that went beyond himself. There'll be paperwork, Bradford said, and training in territorial law. You'll need to come to Cheyenne for a few weeks. But your land is yours, Mr. Thornton. No one can take it from you now. Jake nodded, overwhelmed. Then something occurred to him. Your men, the ones who left you in the storm. Bradford's expression hardened. They're being dealt with. Cowardice in the face of duty is unforgivable. Maybe. Jake met his eyes. But fear makes men stupid. Panic ain't the same as malice. If you're going to be the kind of governor who values mercy over judgment, he let the implication hang. Bradford studied him for a long moment, then laughed, a genuine surprised sound. You just risked offending me to defend men who left me to die. You're either the bravest man I've met or the most foolish. Probably both, Jake admitted. All right, Commissioner, I'll show them mercy. But they'll make amends. Public service, helping those they endangered with their cowardice. Jake nodded. That felt right. Justice tempered with redemption. Sarah would have approved. Bradford remounted his horse, his entourage forming up around him. I'll send word about when to come to Cheyenne. And Mr. Thornton, thank you for everything. Jake raised a hand in acknowledgement, watching them ride away across the pristine snow, black shapes against blinding white, until they disappeared into the tree line. Then he was alone again, but not the same alone as before. He turned to his cabin, seeing it differently now. Not a prison of memory, but a foundation, a place to rebuild from. His eyes caught on Sarah's chair, and for the first time in 5 years, he walked over and sat in it. The wood creaked under his weight. Psst. The cold bit at his face, but somehow it felt right, like he was finally sitting beside her again, instead of just haunting the space she'd left behind. You were right, darling, he said to the empty air, his breath fogging white. About the giving, about what matters. He paused, feeling foolish, feeling free. I'm going to help people now, like you always wanted me to, like you always did, the wind whispered through the pines. And Jake chose to hear it as her answer. Approval, love, release. He stood, his bad leg protesting but strong enough, and walked back inside. The fire needed tending, coffee needed making, life needed living. But first he went to his trunk and pulled out the small wooden box he kept hidden at the bottom. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was Sarah's wedding ring, the one he'd been too heartbroken to bury with her. He held it up to the light, the simple gold band catching the morning sun. For 5 years he'd carried it like a weight, a reminder of what was gone. Now he placed it gently on the mantel, next to the daguerreotype of them on their wedding day. Young, hopeful, whole. I'll always love you, he whispered. But I think it's time I tried living again. 3 months later, spring had finally broken winter's stranglehold on Wyoming. The snow retreated grudgingly, revealing brown earth eager for renewal. Jake stood on his porch, newly repaired, boards no longer rotting, and surveyed his land with new eyes. The past weeks in Cheyenne had been overwhelming. Learning territorial law, meeting officials, understanding the scope of his new authority. But Governor Bradford had been true to his word. Jake was now Commissioner Thornton, with the power to review foreclosure cases, investigate unfair lending practices, and protect homesteaders from predatory bankers. His first official act had been to audit Hargrave's bank. The investigation uncovered fraud so extensive that the banker now sat in jail awaiting trial, his empire of exploitation crumbling. Jake had taken no pleasure in it, just grim satisfaction that justice, delayed but determined, had finally arrived. He heard the wagon before he saw it, the creak of wheels, the plod of horses. A family, by the sound of it. He'd been expecting them. They appeared around the bend in the road, a man, a woman, and 3 children in a weather-beaten wagon piled high with belongings. The kind of desperate hope Jake recognized in their faces. He'd worn it himself not long ago. The man pulled the horses to a stop at Jake's fence. Excuse me, sir. We're looking for Commissioner Thornton. They said in town he might help us with a homestead claim. And Jake walked down the porch steps, limping slightly, and extended his hand. Jake Thornton. And you'd be the Morrison family from Nebraska? Relief flooded the man's weathered face. Yes, sir. We heard Wyoming had good land available for homesteading, but the banker in Bitter Creek said we didn't have enough for the filing fee and that'd be Hargrave's son. Running what's left of the bank, Jake interrupted. Don't you worry about him. The filing fees are waived for families meeting the territory's settlement requirements. Which you do. He smiled at the children's wide-eyed faces. Got some good land parcels available south of here. Rich soil, good water. I'll help you file the claim properly this time. The woman then, exhausted but with fierce determination in her eyes, spoke up. We can pay, Mr. Thornton. Maybe not today, but we're honest people. We'll work hard. Jake thought of Bradford's words. Pay it forward. I know you will, ma'am. That's why you're here. He gestured toward his cabin. It's near sundown. Why don't you folks camp in my barn tonight? It's warm and dry. We'll head to the land office in the morning. As the family settled their wagon, grateful and disbelieving of their luck, Jake stood in his yard and watched the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. The evening was cool but not cold, full of the promise of growth. He thought about that night in January, the storm, the stranger, the choice that had changed everything. And he understood now what Sarah had been trying to teach him all those years. That giving, real giving, wasn't about what you received in return. It was about keeping the chain of kindness alive, passing it forward like a flame from candle to candle, pushing back the darkness one small light at a time. A rider appeared in the distance, and Jake squinted against the setting sun. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Governor Bradford's seal on the saddlebag. Bradford dismounted with a weary smile. "Commissioner, thought I'd check on my best appointment, Governor." Jake shook his hand. "Didn't expect you out this way. Had business in Bitter Creek. Thought I'd see how you're managing." Bradford glanced at the Morrison family's wagon. "I see you're already making a difference. Trying to—" Jake led him to the porch. Where two chairs now sat, he'd finally brought Sarah's chair down from storage and placed another beside it. They sat, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, two men who'd found purpose in the wilderness. "You ever regret it?" Jake asked. "That night traveling without your guards? Nearly dying out there?" Bradford was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "No. That night saved me, Mr. Thornton. Not just my life, my soul. I was becoming the kind of man I'd sworn I'd never be. Cruel, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything for power." He turned to Jake. "You showed me a better way. Reminded me that strength isn't about what you can take, it's about what you're willing to give." Jake nodded slowly. "Sarah used to say something similar. Smart woman. The best." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. Finally, Bradford stood to leave. "You're doing good work here, Jake. Important work. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After the governor rode away, Jake remained on his porch, watching stars emerge one by one in the deepening sky. The Morrison children's laughter drifted from the barn, the sound of family, of life continuing despite hardship. He thought he felt a presence beside him, warm, familiar, approving. Sarah, maybe, or just the evening breeze carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. Either way, it felt like a benediction. "I kept the promise," Jake whispered to the gathering night. "I'm helping them, all of them, just like you wanted." The mountains stood eternal against the stars, ancient and indifferent to human struggles. But in the small spaces between inn cabins and barns, in acts of mercy and chains of kindness, people like Jake Thornton were building something that mattered. Not grand, not glorious, just good. He rose finally, his leg aching but strong enough, and went inside to prepare breakfast supplies for the Morrison family. Tomorrow he'd help them file their claim. Next week, 3 more families were expected. And the week after that, a dispute to settle between neighboring ranchers. Both good men who just needed someone fair to hear them out. The work would never end. There would always be more people who needed help, more injustices to correct, more kindness to pay forward. And Jake Thornton, a lonely rancher who'd once had nothing, discovered he wouldn't have it any other way. Because in the end, Sarah had been right. The measure of a man wasn't what he had. It was what he gave when he had nothing left. And in giving everything to a stranger in a storm, Jake had received something far more valuable than property or position. He'd received purpose, community, hope. He'd received his life back. As he lay down that night, finally sleeping in his marriage bed for the first time in 5 years. Jake's last thought before sleep claimed him was simple and profound. Tomorrow, he'd help the Morrisons build their future. And in doing so, he'd continue building his own. One act of kindness at a time. One person helped. One promise kept. Until the end of his days. 6 months had passed since that spring evening when Jake sat with the governor on his porch. The Morrison family had built a sturdy homestead 3 miles south, their children now attending the new schoolhouse that Jake had fought to establish. The land office in Bitter Creek hummed with legitimate business now, families arriving weekly to claim honest parcels of Wyoming earth. But success, Jake was learning, brought its own kind of trouble. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a nervous young courier who wouldn't meet Jake's eyes. Official territorial seal. Heavy paper. The kind of correspondence that changed things. Jake opened it standing in his doorway, the morning sun warm on his shoulders. As he read, the warmth seemed to drain away, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with weather. "Commissioner Thornton, it has come to our attention that irregularities exist in several homestead claims processed under your authority. Senator Warren Blackwell has filed a formal complaint alleging fraud, corruption, and misappropriation of territorial lands. You are hereby summoned to Cheyenne for an official inquiry. To commence October 1st. Failure to appear will result in immediate suspension of your commission and possible criminal charges. Respectfully, Territorial Board of Land Management." Jake read it twice, his calloused hands tight on the paper. Senator Blackwell. He knew that name. Rich, powerful, owned half the cattle ranches in the Northern Territory. And Jake had rejected his nephew's homestead claim last month because the land was already legally filed by a widow with 3 children. This wasn't about irregularities. This was revenge. Bad news, Commissioner? Jake looked up to find a woman standing at his gate mid-30s. Auburn hair pulled back severely, dressed in practical traveling clothes dusty from the road. But it was her eyes that caught him. Green, sharp with intelligence, and holding something that looked like determination mixed with desperation. "Depends on your perspective, ma'am," Jake said carefully, folding the letter. "Can I help you?" She opened the gate without invitation and walked up his path with the confidence of someone who'd learned not to wait for permission. "My name is Catherine Wells. I'm a journalist from Denver. And yes, Mr. Thornton, I believe you can help me. More importantly, I believe I can help you." Jake's instincts prickled. "Not much interested in journalists, Miss Wells. They tend to write what sells, not what's true." "Mrs. Wells," she corrected, though Jake noticed no ring on her finger. "Widow. And you're right to be cautious. Most of my colleagues are more interested in scandal than substance." She reached the porch steps, her gaze direct and unflinching. "But I've spent the last 3 months investigating Senator Blackwell's land acquisitions. The pattern is consistent. He targets territories with new land commissioners, manufactures corruption charges, gets them removed, and then his associates swoop in to buy up homestead claims at a fraction of their value. You're the 3rd commissioner he's gone after this year." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Oh, it makes you think I'm innocent. Maybe I am corrupt." Catherine smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because I've talked to the families you've helped. The Morrisons. The Chun family. Old Widow Patterson, who was about to lose her land to Hargrave's son before you intervened. They all tell the same story, a man who works for free more often than not, who won't take bribes, who actually gives a damn." She pulled a notebook from her bag. "I want to write the truth about what Blackwell's doing, but I need your cooperation. And proof." Jake studied her, this woman who'd appeared out of nowhere with dangerous information and what sounded like a dangerous plan. Her hands, he noticed, were ink-stained, writer's hands, but also calloused along the palms. Someone who'd known work, real work, before she'd taken up a pen. "Why?" he asked. "What's your stake in this?" Something flickered across Catherine's face-old pain, carefully controlled. "Because Senator Blackwell's business practices destroyed my husband. Daniel was a land commissioner in Montana. Blackwell accused him of fraud. Daniel couldn't prove his innocence before the hearing. The shame." She paused, her professional composure cracking slightly. "He shot himself 3 weeks before our daughter was born." The words hung heavy between them. Jake recognized that particular grief, the kind that never fully healed, just scabbed over enough to let you keep moving. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and meant it. "I don't want sympathy, Mr. Thornton. I want justice, and I want to stop Blackwell before he destroys another good man." She met his eyes. "Will you let me help you?" Jake thought about the letter in his hand, about families who depended on him, about the choice between fighting alone or accepting help from a stranger, which seemed to be becoming a pattern in his life. "All right, Mrs. Wells," he said. "Come inside. We've got work to do." Over the next 2 weeks, Jake's cabin transformed into something between a war room and a newspaper office. Catherine was relentless, methodical, brilliant in ways that reminded Jake of Sarah's quiet intelligence. She mapped out Blackwell's operations across 3 territories, interviewed homesteaders by mail, and built a case that was both damning and meticulously documented. They worked late into the nights, Jake providing land office records while Catherine cross-referenced them with property transfers and bank transactions. The evidence was clear. Blackwell had created a machine for stealing land, using corruption charges as the lever to pry apart legitimate claims. "Here," Catherine said one evening, pointing to a ledger entry. Her finger was close to Jake's as they bent over the documents, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap. It startled him. He hadn't been aware of a woman's presence like that in years. "This payment to Judge Carmichael dated 2 days before your predecessor was removed. It's listed as consulting fees, but Carmichael was the one who signed the removal order," Jake finished. He looked up and found Catherine watching him, her green eyes reflecting lamplight. For a moment neither spoke. "You're a good man, Jake Thornton," she said softly. "Your wife must have been very proud." "She's gone," Jake said, his voice rougher than intended. 5 years now. I know. The Morrisons told me. Catherine's hand almost unconsciously touched his forearm. "Daniel's been gone 4 years. Sometimes I forget what it feels like to talk to someone who understands what that silence is like, that empty space that never quite fills." Jake found himself covering her hand with his own. Yeah, I know that silence. They stayed like that for a heartbeat longer than necessary before Catherine pulled back, professional distance reasserting itself. But something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that grief recognized grief, loneliness recognized loneliness. We should get back to work, she said, but her voice was gentler now. You're due in Cheyenne in 3 days. The territorial hearing room in Cheyenne was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced officials glaring down from the walls. Senator Warren Blackwell sat at the prosecutor's table, impeccably dressed, his silver hair and commanding presence radiating authority. He looked like justice personified. Jake knew better. Evil rarely announced itself with horns and a pitchfork. Usually it wore expensive suits and spoke in reasonable tones. Commissioner Thornton, Blackwell began, his voice smooth as snake oil. You stand accused of processing fraudulent homestead claims, accepting bribes, and misappropriating territorial lands. How do you plead? Jake stood, feeling every eye in the room on him. Governor Bradford sat in the observers section, his face carefully neutral. Catherine was there too, notebook ready, her presence somehow steadying. Not guilty, Senator, and I can prove it. What followed was 3 hours of methodical destruction. Jake presented his records, clean and complete. Catherine provided testimony about Blackwell's pattern of accusations. Bradford himself, when called to speak, vouched for Jake's character with words that carried the weight of personal conviction. But the killing blow came when Catherine produced evidence of Blackwell's payments to Judge Carmichael and 2 other territorial officials, proof of a corruption network that made Jake's alleged crimes look like penny-ante nonsense. Blackwell's composure cracked. His smooth denials became angry accusations, his reasonable tone giving way to rage. And in that rage, he made the fatal mistake of threatening Catherine directly in front of witnesses. You're a vindictive woman, destroying a good man's reputation because your weak husband couldn't handle honest scrutiny. Catherine stood slowly, her face pale but her voice steady as iron. My husband was murdered by your lies, Senator. But unlike him, I have the evidence to prove it. And I have the platform to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are. The room erupted. Blackwell was escorted out, still shouting denials. The board dismissed all charges against Jake and opened an immediate investigation into the senator. It was over. Outside the hearing room, Jake found Catherine standing alone in the hallway, staring at nothing. She'd won, but victory looked a lot like exhaustion. You all right? Jake asked. She turned to him, and he saw tears tracking down her face, the first emotion she'd allowed herself in weeks. Daniel's name is cleared. After 4 years, his name is finally clear. Jake didn't think. He just pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him, sobbing with relief and grief and release. He held her while she shook, this fierce woman who'd fought so hard for justice, and felt something in his own chest unlock. Some door he'd sealed shut when Sarah died. When Catherine finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she laughed shakily. I'm sorry. That was unprofessional. Catherine, Jake said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. I think we're well past professional. She looked up at him, really looked, and Jake saw the question in her eyes. The same question he was asking himself. Where do we go from here? I should get back to Denver, she said, but made no move to leave. Write this story. Make sure Blackwell can't hurt anyone else. You should, Jake agreed. But maybe, ... after that, ... Wyoming could use a good journalist. Someone to hold people accountable. Keep commissioners honest. He paused. And I could use a friend who understands that silence. Catherine's smile was small but genuine. Just a friend? Jake thought about Sarah, about the love he'd carried like a torch for 5 years, about whether moving forward meant betraying backward. Then he remembered Sarah's voice. Let yourself live, Jake. Don't make my leaving mean you stop living too. Maybe more, he said honestly, if you're willing to give a beat-up old rancher a chance. You're not that old, Catherine said, and there was something like hope in her eyes, and I'm not that young. Maybe we're both just tired of being alone. Jake took her hand carefully, like something precious that might break. Then maybe we don't have to be. They stood there in that government hallway. 2 people who'd been broken by loss and remade by purpose, tentatively reaching for something that looked like a future. Not the loves they'd lost, nothing could replace those. But perhaps something new. Something earned through survival and built on understanding. Governor Bradford found them like that. Hands clasped, speaking in low voices about possibilities and maybes. Commissioner, he said, grinning. Mrs. Wells, I believe congratulations are in order. Wells, I've been authorized to offer you a position as official territorial correspondent, documenting land management practices across Wyoming. Bradford's expression turned serious. You've both proven that integrity still exists in this territory. We need more of it. Catherine squeezed Jake's hand. We'll think about it. We? Bradford's grin widened. Well. Commissioner, you work fast. When you've been alone as long as I have, Jake said. Meeting Catherine's eyes, you learn to recognize light when you see it. 3 months later, as winter began to paint Wyoming white again, Jake stood on his newly expanded porch. Catherine was inside, writing her latest article by lamplight, occasionally reading passages aloud for his opinion. Her belongings had arrived from Denver last week, books mostly, and photographs of a man Jake would never meet but had learned to respect. Daniel's picture sat on the mantel now, next to Sarah's. The dead deserved remembering, but they didn't demand the living stop living. The Morrison children ran across his field, playing in the first snow. The widow Patterson lived in the small house Jake had helped her build on the South 40. And Elijah, the 12-year-old orphan Jake had taken in after the hearing, giving the boy Sarah's room and a chance at childhood, was in the barn, learning to care for the horses. Jake wasn't alone anymore. His cabin rang with voices, his table held more than one plate, and his bed, well, Catherine slept in the guest room for now. They were taking things slow, both of them learning how to love again after loss. But sometimes, late at night, she'd come to his door because the silence was too loud, and he'd hold her while she cried for Daniel, or she'd hold him when memories of Sarah cut too deep. They were healing each other, slowly, honestly. Jake, Catherine called from inside, come read this. Tell me if it sounds too sentimental. He smiled, the expression feeling natural now, and turned to go inside. But first he looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Thank you, he whispered to whatever force had brought a stranger to his door that winter night. To Sarah, watching from wherever the good dead watched from. To the chain of kindness that had saved him and given him the chance to save others. Then he went inside to warmth and light and the sound of a voice that made the silence bearable. To life, continuing despite everything. To hope earned hard but held harder. To love different than before, but no less real for being second rather than first. Jake Thornton had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in disaster, that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really made of, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe gives you a second chance. Not to replace what was lost, but to build something new from the ruins. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Well, friends, that's the story of Jake Thornton, a man who learned that sometimes. The greatest wealth comes from having the smallest things and the biggest heart, but also a man who discovered that healing isn't betrayal, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, and that the human heart has room for more love than we think possible. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that kindness matters especially when times are hardest, and that it's never too late for a second chapter, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment telling us, when have you been helped by a stranger or helped someone yourself? Have you found love after loss? We read every single one, and your stories inspire us to keep bringing you these tales of hearts on the frontier. Until next time, remember, the measure of a person isn't found in what they own, but in what they're willing to give when they have nothing left. And remember, too, that endings can become beginnings if we're brave enough to let them. This is Hearts on the Frontier, where wild lands meet untamed hearts. See you around the camp.